Right, I thought this time I'd do something different. I'd do a ranking video on music, and I'll start off with one of my favourite bands, Genesis. There's 15 albums in total, so I'll try and get through them as quickly as I can. If you're trying to get into this band as well, I'd recommend getting this album. Sorry about the sticker, I did try to peel it off, but I've had this for quite a long time and that sticker ain't coming off. And yeah, it's 3 CDs. It goes through all this history from like the very beginnings to the end, starting off with the first album all the way to the last album. So if you're trying to get into Genesis, I recommend getting this album. So I'll start off with what I consider the worst Genesis album, coming in at number 15. I've written them all down and I've just listened to them all recently again, so I wanted them all like fresh in my mind. And yeah, by far the worst right at the bottom is Calling All Stations. Which is the very last Genesis album. Phil Collins had left the band at this point, but Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford thought they'd carry on. It's definitely missing that spark, I think, that Phil Collins brought to the band. It's not a terrible album as such, it's just the worst one that they did, I reckon. I've gone back to this album a few times to try and think that maybe I'm missing something here, because a lot of these Genesis albums kind of grew on me, but this one I've gone back to it numerous times, and yeah, it's by far the worst in my opinion. There's not really many tracks in this album which really reach out and grab my attention. I would probably say that the Dividing Line is my favourite track in this album because it's got that sort of like Phil Collins-esque drum sort of like sound in it, but obviously Phil Collins was on the drums on this album. It features Ray Wilson as a singer. All in all, it's not, like I say, it's not a terrible album, it's just the worst one they did in my opinion. And yeah, Calling All Stations, number 15. Number 14, going right from the end right to the beginning, From Genesis to Revelation. This was the first album they did, obviously. I think this album was originally intended to be written for other artists because they just started out as songwriters, but they were told to put this album together. They're all quite young on this album. It features all the original members as well. I do actually think out of all the members in the band at this point, Peter Gabriel really sort of like sounds really good on this album. And again, with Calling All Stations, there's nothing really on this album that really grabs my attention. I mean, the songs are okay. This album was done right at the end of the 60s. It's got that very 60s sort of like pop sound to it. So yeah, I mean, it's not a bad album, this one. Quite an interesting one to listen to because it's nothing like anything they did after. But yeah, it's an okay album. I think the next album they obviously had a lot more to prove, and it was a much better album than this one. But yeah, it's an okay album. Just I think these bottom two usually come at the bottom of most people's lists for various reasons, but the beginning and the very end of Genesis for me was kind of where they were the weakest. So yeah, number 14, From Genesis to Revelations. Number 13, Abacab. Yeah, definitely strange name for an album, and probably the most strangest Genesis album. I mean, it's very sort of hit and miss, this album. I think either a lot of people love it or they hate it. I think they were kind of experimenting a lot because it was the beginning of the 80s, and they wanted to try out different styles maybe, but I think the title track, Abacab, is probably the strongest song on the album. It's a song that I quite like. The rest of the album, though, doesn't really do a lot for me. Not a bad album, but it's definitely one of their weakest, I'd say. Keep It Dark is also quite a decent single on it, but yeah, the rest of the album doesn't really do much for me. Number 12, the self-entitled Genesis album, which I have here. It's one of the few that I have on CD. Most people just listen to albums online now, but I've had some of these albums quite a long time. So this is my number 12, Genesis. This album is quite like it. I mean, from start to finish. A lot of people say side 1 is better than side 2 in terms of how it was on record. I actually disagree. I actually prefer the second half of the album compared to the first half of the album. A lot of people talk about the single Mama. I actually don't quite like Mama. I think it's one of the worst singles Genesis ever did. It doesn't really do a lot for me. It's got that very Phil Collins sort of like pop sound to it, but it doesn't really do much for me. I do quite like a lot of stuff that Phil Collins did as a solo artist, but Mama, even as a fan of Phil Collins, it just doesn't do a lot for me. That's All, I think, is actually one of the best singles he ever did, well, pop singles he ever did. I do really like that song. Got Home by the Sea, Second Home by the Sea. It's okay. Illegal Alien, a lot of people love or hate that song. But the last few songs of this album I actually really like. The last song of the album, It's Gonna Get Better, I quite like. Yeah, so number 12, Genesis. Decent album. Number 11, Invisible Touch. The most mainstream, best-selling album Genesis ever did. It's probably the one that most people recognise the band, because they obviously reached out to a wider audience with this one. It's a decent pop album. Not much progressive on this album again. My favourite track on this album is Domino, which has sort of like 2 parts. It's quite a lengthy song, which a lot of Genesis fans of old kind of can get into, I suppose. The title track, Invisible Touch, is pretty good as well. And, there's a few other decent singles on this album. Throw and Get All Away as well is another single I like on this album. Yeah, it's pretty much just a pop album really, but quite a decent one. If you like your 80s music, it's got that very 80s sound to it, which I quite like. Very Phil Collins sort of dominated, it seems, on this album. But yeah, I mean, it's a decent album. So number 10, We Can't Dance. Which I have here on CD. We Can't Dance again is another album that divides a lot of people, because again, a lot of people say this album was a pop album. You know, I think this was the album that Phil Collins said that he was most involved in terms of writing anyway. I actually think it contains one of the best Genesis and Phil Collins song, and that's Driving the Last Spike. That's a track I really like. I actually really like this album. It gets a lot of hate, this album, for some reason. I mean, again, a lot of people are divided on it. I think I watch a lot of people's ranking videos on Genesis, and they tend to put this at the bottom or near the bottom. For me, it's about in the middle. But yeah, I think it contains a bit of everything, this album. It's still got that sort of like pop sound, but they also bring back a lot of that progressive 70s Genesis to it a little bit, and there's also something a bit new in it as well that we've not heard before. But overall, from start to finish, I quite like this album. You just take it for what it is. Yeah, there's a lot of tracks on here which are very pop, very probably not what the old Genesis fans were after, but still, I enjoy this album. I really do. I think it's one of the better Genesis albums that they did in the later years, throughout the 80s and the 90s. I think this is one of the best ones that they did after the 70s anyway. So yeah, number 10, We Can't Dance. What other tracks are on this? I think like Living Forever was a song that I really liked as well. No Son of Mine. I think it's got that very Mike and the Mechanics sound to it as well, from Mike Rutherford on this album. But yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely worth a listen, especially if you're into that later sound of Genesis, where Phil Collins was sort of like becoming really popular as a singer. But yeah, it's an album I enjoy anyway. Number 10, We Can't Dance. Number 9, Duke. This was the album that the sound really started to change. I think this was 1980, this album came out. And they were definitely shifting away from that 70s progressive rock sound and going into the more sort of like pop rock sound of the 80s. Very more sort of synthesized sound to it from Tony Banks on keyboards. I think Phil Collins was really starting to grow more as a singer on this one. I think it was around this time he started to write his first solo album as well. It's kind of the favourite of both old fans and new fans, this one, because even though it goes into that more sort of like 80s pop sound, there's still quite a bit on this album that still retains some of that old Genesis sound. So a lot of the old Genesis fans tend to say this was probably the last best Genesis album that they did, but I just take it for every album for what it is. I enjoy this one. I think this is the best album that Genesis put out throughout the 80s and the 90s. Some highlights on this is obviously like, well, it's sort of like a bookend, this album. You've got Behind the Lines, Duchess, goes into guide vocal, then it ends with Duke's Travel, Duke's End. So I think they were trying to connect this album. Obviously includes one of the first biggest pop hits, Misunderstanding, which I quite like. It's got a couple of weak tracks in it, but overall it's a solid album, this one. So yeah, number 9, Duke. I think definitely Phil Collins as a singer was sounding a lot better in this album. So yeah. Number 8, probably going to surprise a lot of people, this one, but Foxtrot. I'd say that Get 'Em Out by Friday is my favourite track on this album. It's a song that I really like. Supper's Ready is obviously the track that everyone talks about in this album. I just think it's a little bit too long, and there's not enough in the song to keep me excited from beginning to end. I mean, it's regarded as one of the best, if not the best, Genesis tracks, but like I say, I'd say other songs like The Musical Box, slightly better in my opinion. But Get 'Em Out by Friday is definitely my favourite track on this album. It's a track that I really like. I think Peter Gabriel sounds really good on this album. Watcher of Skies is also really another song that's quite good on this album. Like I said, I do really like this album. Yeah, it's just getting to that point now on this list where we get into the very good albums, so I had to put Foxtrot somewhere, and it just comes at number 8 on my list. So yeah. So my next album, number 7, is Nursery Crime. Again, probably another surprise to people. Nursery Crime obviously came before Foxtrot, so we're around that same era. I actually really liked this album. I hadn't listened to it for a long time. I think it's the shortest album they did as well. Contains a musical box, obviously, a track that I really like. You can tell that with this album they were starting to get better at what they were doing. Phil Collins had just joined the band, Steve Hackett had just joined the band as well, so 2 new members. It's definitely got that more sort of like variety in the sound than the previous album Trespass had, but yeah, it sits at number 7. I mean, again, this comes at top of people's list. They love this album. A lot of people. I really like this album. It's definitely got that old school prog rock Genesis sound to it, that English sound to it, which I really like. You get to hear Phil Collins sing his first song as well. I mean, I think he wrote it with Steve Hackett as well. But yeah, overall, I mean, just like with Foxtrot, I really like this album, Nursery Crime. I like the artwork as well on it. But yeah, it just sits at number 7 for me. I mean, I think we're getting to the really good albums now, so it's getting really difficult to rank these and to put them somewhere. Alright, now number 6. Now this album is probably the least talked about and most underrated Genesis album, I think, out of the entire list. And again, it's probably going to surprise some people that I've put it quite high, but this is my list. So number 6 for me is And Then There Were Three. Obviously titled And Then There Were Three because Steve Hackett left the band and now there are just 3 remaining members: Phil Collins, Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford. And it's obvious with this album that it's missing a lot of guitar parts because Mike Rutherford decided to take up both the guitar as well as bass. But this album's sort of more dominated by Tony Banks' keyboards and synthesizers, I'd say. I'd also say that this album is probably the last prog album of Genesis. I mean, that's controversial, but it's definitely the last album to me, in my opinion, that has that old sort of Genesis sound to it. They were definitely going on into writing more shorter songs, and I wouldn't class any of these. Well, the only pop song I'd say in this album is Follow You, Follow Me, which was actually the first sort of biggest hit that they had. A song that I really like, but for the majority, this album is definitely still a prog album, I'd say. And it's got some good songs in it. I mean, Down and Out, I think Phil Collins' drumming on this album is really good. It's got a good sound to it, this album, as well. I think it's well produced. Yeah, it's one of my favourite tracks from this album is also Deep in the Motherlode. I really like that song. There's also some other great songs on this, such as Burning Rope. I really like The Lady Lies. Undertow is obviously another great song. I think the only song I don't really like that much on this album is Snowbound. A lot of people love it. It doesn't do much for me, but from start to finish, apart from Snowbound probably, I really like this album. I think it's a good solid album by Genesis. Again, like after Peter Gabriel's departure, they proved with this album, I think, that they could still do a decent quality album without Steve Hackett as well. I think from Duke onwards, well, they really started to change the sound, but with this album, this is sort of like the bridge, in my opinion, of the 2 eras of Genesis that people are familiar with. Alright, where was I? Alright, number 6, yeah, And Then There Were Three. Yeah, great album, very underrated in my opinion. Still follows on from the 70s era Genesis that I enjoy and like listening to. Yeah, there's a couple of members missing, but still, I think with the remaining 3 members, they did a really good job with this album, and I don't think it gets the credit that it deserves, to be honest. Really enjoy this one. And Then There Were Three. Number 5, Trespass. I think a lot of people talk about The Knife on this record. It's a track that I really like, but my favourite tracks are Stagnation and Looking for Someone, the first track. All the members sound great this album. Peter Gabriel sounds great. Got Anthony Phillips on guitar. I think it's a great album from start to finish, this one. I think with Foxtrot and possibly Nursery Crime, there were maybe 1 or 2 tracks that I didn't quite sit with me, but with this one I really enjoy it from start to finish. It's a great album. I mean, all these albums that are in the top 5 now, I've put I think really highly of. I mean, I love them all. Can't really say a bad word about any of them, to be honest. But Trespass comes in at number 5. I think Peter Gabriel sounds really good on this album. I mean, the difference between Trespass and From Genesis to Revelations is just like night and day, to be honest. It's got more of a rock and folk feel to it, I'd say. I mean, I really do like the drumming on this album. I know about John Mayhew on drums. Possibly they say he's not technically as good as say Phil Collins is on drums, but kind of completely different styles of drumming. I mean, Phil Collins is more of like a fusion drummer. John Mayhew sounds more of like a rock drummer. Sort of similar that you get on like The Who or Led Zeppelin. Maybe he just wasn't suited for Genesis and what they were trying to achieve in the music. I don't really know, but it sounds alright to me. I enjoy this album. So yeah, Trespass, number 5. Anthony Phillips as well brings that kind of folk sort of sound to it. I mean, Steve Hackett did something similar later on, but yeah, it would have been interesting to see what Genesis would have ended up doing later on if Anthony Phillips would have stayed in the band. But yeah, it's still a great album, this. Number 5, Trespass, and number 4. Oh, I've got this one. Wind and Wuthering. I really like the artwork to this album as well. And, yeah, this album, second album that they did after Peter Gabriel's departure, and another album which from start to finish is great. It's got more of like this romantic feeling to this album. One thing I really do like about this album, it contains 4 instrumentals which I really enjoy. I mean, I think it was Phil Collins who came up with the idea after Peter Gabriel left that we should just do instrumental albums. Obviously, with them being songwriters, that wasn't going to happen, but you know, pretty much nearly 50% of this album's instrumental, and I really enjoy that. And I really like the way this album ends with In That Quiet Earth and Afterglow. It's a great album, this. Kind of think it's a little bit underrated, to be honest, because you don't hear about it that much. But I really enjoy this one. I think it's because there were no like big hit singles off it, so that's probably why you don't hear much of this album. But it's a great like mid-70s prog rock album, this, and it's definitely kind of dominated, I think, by Tony Banks. Steve Hackett's on this quite a bit with Blood on the Rooftops. I know a lot of his ideas weren't put on the album. That was probably one of the reasons why he ended up leaving the band. I don't really know. But this is the last album to feature Steve Hackett. Great guitarist. Yeah, it's a great album, this, from start to finish. Love it. Wind and Wuthering, number 4. Number 3. Selling England by the Pound. Yeah, they just really sounded like great as a band on this album. I mean, Firth the Fifth, The Cinema Show, Dancing by the Moonlit Night, great tracks. Kind of the sort of music that you want to listen to when you want to listen to sort of like some progressive rock music. It's a great album both from start to finish. I like every track on this album. A good, strong, solid album by Genesis. And Selling England by the Pound is my number 3. So my number 2, and this one was really tough to put. It almost made number 1, but it's number 2. And it might surprise some people, but The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. The final album to feature Peter Gabriel as a singer, unfortunately. He's a great singer, Peter Gabriel. I'm a big fan of his solo stuff. But he decided to leave after this one for various reasons, but it's a great album, this. Very much dominated by Peter Gabriel, I think, in the lyrics especially. But the rest of the band bring something to the table as well. I mean, there's so many tracks on this album that I could literally do a video just on this album, because there's quite a lot to talk about. I mean, it's a concept album, it's 2 CDs, so there's a lot of Genesis on here. I think the only reason it missed out on the top spot is it's quite hit and miss in some places. Like, it has some of the greatest Genesis moments, but there's also a little bit of weak points in this album. And I'm not necessarily talking about those strange sort of like instrumental parts that sort of like Steve Hackett and Tony Banks I think were involved in. I quite like them actually. One of my favourite tracks on this album actually is It, the very last song, which a lot of people either just don't like or don't talk about, but I think it's a great sort of like fusion track. I think Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins did that one just to finish off the album and rushed it, but it's a great track, I love it. But I like so many tracks in this album. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is a great track. Carpet Crawlers I really like. Yeah, this is one of those albums as well which kind of grew on me. I remember when I first listened to it, and I didn't quite know what to make of it at first, and then after the second and then third listen I was like, yeah, I really enjoy this album. I mean, it's kind of a strange album in many ways. It's very, I would say, sort of unique. There's not many other Genesis albums that actually sound similar to this. It's kind of got its own sort of like feel to it. Kind of hard to describe. You'll just have to listen to it yourself. But yeah, this is a quality album. Love it. So yeah, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, number 2. So my number 1, and this album is just brilliant. I love from start to finish, and it was kind of I kind of knew it was probably going to be my number 1, but I had to go through all the albums again and just make sure I was happy with where I was going to position these albums on this list. But yeah, my number 1 is A Trick of the Tail. Yeah, every single track in this album is brilliant. From start to finish, love it. It's almost as if the band had a point to prove, because Gabriel had left, and it's like, well, we need to show everyone that we can still do it, you know, and I think they're going above and beyond with it. I mean, it's just brilliant. I mean, the highlights on this album are actually the softer songs, I'd say, like Entangled, Ripples. They sort of like take you to another dimension when you listen to them. And then you've got the heavier songs like Dance of Volcano, Squonk, Los Endos are instrumental at the end. But every single like track, even like Robbery, Assault and Battery, I mean, that brings a bit of humour to this album, kind of like what Peter Gabriel did with early records. But yeah, I mean, every song on this album, I love it. It's brilliant. And I love the artwork as well. I mean, look at this. It's great. And yeah, Trick of the Tail, number 1. I think a lot of people seem to like this album, even the like early Peter Gabriel fans that seem to criticise the 80s Genesis. I think even a lot of them seem to accept that this album at least is still a great album. I mean, it's still progressive rock. Every member on this album is brilliant. They sound really good as a band. Great songwriting, great music. It's got everything in this album. I love it. It's just a great progressive rock album, and I can't fault it at all. It's brilliant. So yeah, Trick of the Tail. Obviously now with just 4 members instead of 5, it brought more to the table, I think, for the other members to put something into it. And yeah, I mean, let me know your thoughts. I'm sure your lists are all different to mine. I mean, I've been watching a lot of these videos and everybody's list is completely different in the way they regard these albums, but this is where I would put them personally. But yeah, that's my 15 ranking of the Genesis albums. So let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll catch you next time.